I stood in my own bedroom doorway, watching my son Bob rifle through my dresser drawers like I was already dead. His wife Jennifer sat on my bed, the bed I'd shared with his father for 43 years, holding up my favorite blue cardigan with a look of disgust. "Mom, you can't keep wearing these old things," Bob said without even glancing at me. "People will think we don't take care of you. You need help getting dressed." I clutched my coffee cup tighter, the ceramic warm against my palms, and something inside me shifted. What they didn't know was that later that afternoon I had an appointment with my attorney. What they really didn't know was what I was about to do with every single thing they thought would someday be theirs. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Thompson, though everyone has always called me Maggie. I'm 74 years old, and I live in the same house I've called home for the past 52 years on Maple Street in Madison, Wisconsin. The house sits on a corner lot with mature oak trees that my late husband Harold planted when we were newlyweds. Those trees have grown tall and strong, their branches now shading the entire front yard, and in autumn they turn the most brilliant gold you've ever seen. I used to love raking those leaves with Harold every October, making huge piles for the neighborhood children to jump in. Now the leaves just fall and stay where they land, because my son Bob hired a landscaping service that comes twice a month and blows them all away with loud machines. I wasn't always alone in this house. For most of my adult life it buzzed with activity. Harold worked as a manager at the local hardware store, and I taught 3rd grade at Jefferson Elementary for 37 years. We raised 3 children here: Bob, my oldest at 51, then Sarah, who died in a car accident when she was 28, and Michael, who moved to Seattle after college and calls maybe twice a year if I'm lucky. The house used to smell like Sunday pot roast and fresh coffee every morning. The kitchen table was always set for company, because Harold had a gift for making everyone feel welcome. We hosted neighborhood barbecues, birthday parties, holiday dinners, and quiet Tuesday evenings, where friends would just drop by to sit on the front porch and watch the sunset. After Harold passed 6 years ago from complications after his second heart surgery, the house grew quieter. Not empty, exactly, but different. I learned to cook for one, though I still sometimes accidentally set 2 places at the table. I learned to sleep on just one side of the bed, though I still buy 2 pillows out of habit. I learned to make all the decisions myself. What to watch on television, when to turn the heat up, whether to plant tomatoes or peppers in the garden, decisions that Harold and I used to make together without even thinking about it. The house itself is a modest 2-story colonial, with white siding and black shutters. Harold painted those shutters himself every few years, and I used to tease him about being so particular about the trim work. The front porch wraps around one corner and has a swing that Harold built from scratch. Inside, the rooms are comfortable but not fancy. The living room has the same burgundy sofa we bought in 1987, though I've covered it with a cream-colored throw to hide the worn spots. The dining room still has my grandmother's china cabinet filled with dishes I almost never use anymore. The kitchen is small but efficient, with yellow walls that Harold painted to match the morning sunlight. Upstairs are 3 bedrooms and 1 full bathroom, with the original pink tile that we always meant to replace but somehow never got around to. What most people don't know about me is that I'm not just a retired teacher living on a pension. Harold was smart with money, much smarter than he ever let on. He invested wisely, saved consistently, and when he died, he left me very well provided for. The house is paid off completely. I have a healthy savings account, a portfolio of stocks and bonds that continues to grow, and a life insurance policy that will leave a substantial inheritance. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Harold also inherited a small farm property from his uncle in rural Wisconsin, 160 acres of prime agricultural land that we've been leasing to local farmers for the past 15 years. The rental income from that land alone is more than enough to cover all my monthly expenses. But my children, especially Bob, see only what they want to see. They see an aging woman living alone in a house that's too big for her. They see someone who sometimes forgets where she put her reading glasses, or takes a little longer to climb the stairs. They see vulnerability where I see independence, and they see opportunity where I see my life. Bob started visiting more frequently about 2 years ago, always with Jennifer in tow. At first I was delighted. After Harold died, I'd felt so isolated, so grateful for any company. Bob would call on Saturday mornings and say they were driving over to check on me, and I'd spend the morning cleaning the house and preparing snacks as if they were honored guests instead of my own family. I'd set out the good china teacups and make Harold's favorite coffee cake from scratch. I'd put on my nicest dress and make sure my hair was combed just right. But those visits began to feel less like social calls and more like inspections. Jennifer would walk through the house with her arms crossed, pointing out dust on the baseboards or expired coupons stuck to my refrigerator. Bob would check the locks on all the doors and windows, test the smoke detectors, and ask pointed questions about my medications. They'd exchange glances when they thought I wasn't looking, the kind of loaded looks that pass between married couples who've discussed something privately. Gradually, their concern shifted from helpful to invasive. Bob started showing up unannounced, using the spare key Harold had given him years ago for emergencies. I'd be in my garden or reading in the living room, and suddenly I'd hear the front door opening and Bob calling out, "Mom, are you okay?" As if finding me peacefully occupied in my own home was somehow surprising. Jennifer began reorganizing my kitchen cabinets without asking, throwing away spices she deemed too old and rearranging my dishes in ways that made no sense to me. She'd hold up a can of tomatoes and say, "This expired last month, Maggie. You could get food poisoning," even though I'd been safely eating canned goods my entire adult life. The comments about my appearance started subtly. Jennifer would arrive and look me up and down with a slight frown, then suggest we go through my closet together to freshen up my wardrobe. She'd pull out dresses I'd worn to church for years and declare them outdated or unflattering. Bob would notice if I wore the same sweater 2 weeks in a row and ask if I was having trouble keeping track of my clothes. When I explained that I simply liked that particular sweater and saw no reason not to wear it whenever I pleased, he'd nod with the patient expression people use when they think you're not quite understanding something important. They began making decisions for me without consultation. Jennifer hired a house cleaning service and had them come twice a month, even though I told her repeatedly that I was perfectly capable of maintaining my own home and preferred to do so. Bob arranged for grocery delivery without asking what I actually needed, and the delivery person would arrive with bags full of items I never would have chosen: sugar-free cookies, low-sodium soup, prune juice, and other things that I suppose he thought were appropriate for someone my age. When I protested, he'd say, "Mom, we're just trying to make things easier for you. You don't need to be carrying heavy grocery bags anymore." The real turning point came 3 months ago during one of their regular visits. I had dressed carefully that morning in a navy blue dress with small white flowers that Harold had always complimented me on. I'd styled my hair and put on lipstick and the pearl earrings Harold gave me for our 20th anniversary. I felt pretty, confident, ready for company. When Bob and Jennifer arrived, I was arranging fresh flowers from my garden in a vase on the dining room table. Jennifer looked me up and down and sighed. "Oh, Maggie," she said in a tone that dripped with pity, "that dress is so old-fashioned. And your hair—" She reached toward me as if to smooth down an imaginary stray piece. "Maybe we should find you someone who can help you with these things." Bob nodded seriously. "Mom, we've been talking and we think you might benefit from having someone come in a few times a week. You know, to help with personal care, make sure you're eating properly, keep you company." I felt my face grow warm. "Personal care?" "Well," Jennifer said delicately, "things like helping you choose appropriate clothes, making sure you're bathing regularly, keeping track of your medications, just basic, daily living skills that can become challenging as we age." The implication hung in the air like smoke. They thought I was failing, declining, becoming incapable of caring for myself. They thought I needed supervision, management, control. They looked at me and saw not their mother and mother-in-law who had successfully managed a household, raised children, and taught hundreds of students for nearly 4 decades, but a confused old woman who couldn't be trusted to dress herself appropriately. "I don't need help getting dressed," I said quietly, but they weren't really listening. Bob was already pulling out his phone. "I found this great agency that specializes in senior care. They're very gentle, very respectful. The woman I spoke with said they could start with just a few hours a week and increase the support as needed." As needed. As if my decline was inevitable. Just a matter of scheduling. That night after they left, I sat in Harold's old recliner and looked around the living room. Everything was exactly as I wanted it. The books on the side table were the ones I was currently reading. The television was tuned to the programs I enjoyed. The thermostat was set to the temperature that kept me comfortable. The lights were bright enough for me to see clearly, but not so bright as to be harsh. This was my space, arranged according to my preferences, maintained according to my standards. I thought about Harold and how he would have reacted to this conversation. He'd respected my independence even when we were married, never assuming he knew better than I did about my own needs and preferences. He'd valued my opinion, asked for my input on decisions, treated me as an equal partner in our marriage and our household. Even when his illness made him physically dependent on me during his final months, he never talked down to me or made me feel small. But somehow my own son had learned to see me as less than capable, less than competent, less than whole. Somewhere along the way, Bob had started thinking of me not as his mother, who had raised him, supported him, and loved him unconditionally, but as a problem to be managed, a responsibility to be handled, a burden to be organized. That's when I decided to call my attorney. Harold and I had used the same law firm for decades, Patterson Wells and Associates, downtown on State Street. Our lawyer, David Patterson Jr., had handled our wills, our property transfers, and all our legal affairs since we first bought the house. David Sr. had retired years ago, but his son had taken over the practice and knew our family history well. I'd updated my will twice since Harold's death, mostly to account for changes in the value of our assets and to clarify the distribution of specific items. I called David's office the Monday morning after Bob and Jennifer's visit and asked for an appointment. His secretary, Carol, had been with the firm for 20 years and always remembered to ask about my garden and my volunteer work at the church. She scheduled me for that Friday afternoon, and I spent the week thinking carefully about what I wanted to discuss. When Friday arrived, I dressed in my best suit, a charcoal gray wool blend that I'd bought for Harold's funeral but had worn to other formal occasions since then. I did my hair carefully, applied my makeup with precision, and chose my jewelry thoughtfully. I wanted to look like exactly what I was, a competent, intelligent woman in full possession of her faculties. David's office was on the 4th floor of a converted Victorian mansion that housed several professional practices. The waiting room had tall ceilings and original hardwood floors, with comfortable chairs and recent magazines. When Carol called my name, I followed her down a hallway lined with law books and diplomas to David's corner office. David Patterson Jr. was about 50, with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He stood when I entered and shook my hand warmly. "Mrs. Thompson, it's good to see you. How are you adjusting? I know these first few years after losing a spouse can be challenging." I took the chair across from his desk and set my purse beside me. "I'm doing well, David. Better than some people seem to think." He raised an eyebrow and opened a folder on his desk. "What can I help you with today?" I told him about Bob and Jennifer's recent behavior, about their suggestions regarding personal care assistance, about their assumptions regarding my capabilities. I explained how they'd been making decisions for me without consultation and treating me like I was incapable of managing my own affairs. David listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and considered my words carefully. "Mrs. Thompson, you seem very clear-headed and capable to me. Are you feeling pressured or coerced in any way?" "Not exactly," I said. "But I'm concerned about where this is heading. I feel like they're positioning themselves to take over my life gradually, piece by piece. Today, it's help getting dressed. Tomorrow, it might be moving me to assisted living or taking control of my finances." David nodded. "Unfortunately, what you're describing is not uncommon. Adult children sometimes struggle to respect their aging parents' autonomy, especially when inheritance is involved." He paused delicately. "May I ask about your current will?" I explained that under my current will, Bob would inherit the house and most of my assets, with smaller portions going to Michael and to Harold's sister Ruth. The farm property was to be divided equally among all three, with provisions for the grandchildren's college educations. "And you're reconsidering these arrangements?" I looked out his office window at the busy street below. People walked by with purpose, going about their daily business, making their own choices about where to go and what to do. "David, I've been thinking about respect, about dignity, about what we owe each other as family members. He waited for me to continue. Harold left me well provided for because he trusted me to make good decisions with his legacy. He trusted me to use our assets wisely, to take care of myself, to live according to my own values and preferences. He never once suggested that I was too old or too confused to manage my own affairs. I opened my purse and pulled out a small notebook where I'd written down my thoughts over the past week. Bob seems to think I'm failing, that I need supervision and management. He treats me like I'm a burden, an obligation, someone whose wishes don't really matter because I'm supposedly not competent to have wishes. David was taking notes again. What would you like to do? I looked at him directly. I want to change my will. I want to leave the house and the farm to someone who actually values what Harold and I built together. Someone who respects my judgment and my independence. We spent the next hour discussing options. David explained that I had the legal right to distribute my assets however I chose, as long as I was mentally competent to make such decisions. He could arrange for a formal competency evaluation if needed, though he saw no indication that one was necessary. We discussed various charitable organizations, other family members and friends who might be appropriate beneficiaries. By the time I left his office, we had outlined a completely new estate plan. The bulk of my assets would go to establish a scholarship fund at Jefferson Elementary, the school where I'd taught for so many years. The house would go to my neighbor Ruth Ellen, a widow my age who had been a dear friend and who had always treated me with respect and kindness. The farm property would be donated to the County Land Conservancy to be preserved as open space in perpetuity. Bob would inherit my personal belongings and a small cash amount, enough to cover funeral expenses and settle any outstanding debts, but nothing more. The will would include a letter explaining my reasoning, making it clear that this decision was based on his treatment of me during my lifetime, not on any lack of love or any impairment of my judgment. David assured me that the new will would be ironclad, properly witnessed, and legally binding. He also suggested that I consider other ways to protect my autonomy while I was still alive, such as advance directives regarding medical care and legal documents that would prevent anyone from making decisions for me without my explicit consent. I drove home that afternoon feeling lighter than I had in months. For the first time since Harold's death, I felt like I was in control of my own destiny again. I wasn't just responding to other people's assumptions about my capabilities. I was actively shaping my own future according to my own values. That evening, I called my friend Martha, who lived 3 blocks away and had been my teaching colleague for 15 years. Martha was 76 and had been widowed for 8 years. She lived independently in a small cottage, drove her own car, managed her own finances, and volunteered at the hospital twice a week. She was exactly the kind of woman I aspired to be, dignified, self-sufficient, and unwilling to be diminished by other people's expectations. "Martha," I said when she answered the phone, "I did something today that I think Harold would be proud of." I told her about my meeting with David, about the new will, about my decision to take control of my own legacy. Martha listened carefully and then laughed, not mockingly, but with genuine delight. "Good for you, Maggie," she said. "It's about time someone stood up to that son of yours. He's been treating you like an invalid for months, and frankly, it's been painful to watch." Martha had noticed Bob and Jennifer's behavior too. She'd seen them arrive at my house and leave with boxes of my belongings that they'd deemed inappropriate or unsafe. She'd witnessed Jennifer directing the house cleaning crew to reorganize my personal items according to her own preferences. She'd heard Bob talking to neighbors about my supposed decline, asking them to call him if they noticed anything concerning about my behavior. "The thing is," Martha said, "they don't see you the way the rest of us do. When I look at you, I see someone who's handling widowhood with grace and strength. I see someone who's learning to live alone, but not letting that make her lonely. I see someone who's stayed active and engaged and interesting." Her words meant more to me than I could express. It was validation that my own perception of myself was accurate, that I wasn't deluding myself about my capabilities or my judgment. We talked for nearly an hour about aging, about family relationships, about the difference between appropriate concern and inappropriate control. Martha had faced similar challenges with her own adult children, who had eventually learned to respect her boundaries after she made it clear that interference would result in reduced contact. The hardest part, Martha said, is that they think they're being loving. They think concern equals care, and care equals control. They don't understand that real love means trusting someone to make their own decisions, even when you might not agree with those decisions. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and looked around at the space Harold and I had shared for so many years. Everything in this room told the story of our life together. The coffee maker we'd bought for our 25th anniversary, the wooden cutting board Harold had made in his workshop, the ceramic canisters I'd chosen because they matched the yellow paint on the walls, the small herb garden outside the window that we'd planted together and that I'd maintained since his death. This wasn't the home of someone who was failing or declining. This was the home of someone who was continuing to live fully and purposefully. Yes, I was older now. Yes, I moved a little more slowly and forgot things occasionally. But I was still fundamentally the same person I'd always been. Capable, thoughtful, independent, and deserving of respect. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in months. I had a plan now, a way to reclaim my dignity and protect my autonomy. I also had a secret that would remain mine until the day I died. Bob and Jennifer could continue to treat me like an incompetent old woman if they chose to. But they would eventually discover the cost of that choice. I spent the morning in my garden pulling weeds and deadheading the roses that Harold had planted along our back fence. The physical work felt good, and the sunshine warmed my shoulders as I knelt in the dirt. Mrs. Peterson from next door called over the fence to compliment my tomatoes, and we chatted for a few minutes about the unusually mild weather we'd been having. As I worked, I thought about the letter I would include with my new will, the explanation I owed to anyone who might question my decisions. I would write it carefully, without anger or bitterness, but with absolute clarity about why I had chosen to distribute my assets as I had. I would explain that love and respect must go hand in hand, that inheritance is not an entitlement but a gift that should be earned through kindness and consideration. I would write about Harold and how he had always treated me as an equal partner, never assuming that age or widowhood had somehow diminished my worth or my judgment. I would write about the difference between helping someone and controlling them, between concern and condescension. I would write about dignity and what it means to honor the people we claim to love. But that letter was still weeks away. First, I had to get through whatever Bob and Jennifer had planned for me next. I had to continue living my life on my own terms while they tried to convince me that I was incapable of doing so. I had to maintain my strength and my clarity while they chipped away at my confidence with their constant suggestions and corrections. The difference was that now I had something they didn't know about. I had power that they couldn't see, control that they couldn't touch. I had made a choice that would outlast all their efforts to diminish me, and that knowledge gave me a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. When I came inside from the garden, I washed my hands carefully and made myself a proper lunch. I set the table with my good dishes, poured myself a glass of the wine Harold and I used to share on Saturday afternoons, and ate slowly while reading a book I'd borrowed from the library. It was a simple meal, but it was exactly what I wanted, prepared the way I liked it, eaten at my own pace in my own home. This was my life, and it was a good life. I was not a problem to be solved or a burden to be managed. I was a woman who had loved deeply and worked hard, and raised children, and contributed to her community for 74 years. I deserved better than being told I needed help getting dressed by people who had never bothered to understand who I really was. Soon enough, they would learn. But for now, I was content to keep my secret and live my life with the quiet satisfaction of knowing that dignity, once lost, can sometimes be reclaimed in the most unexpected ways. The changes didn't happen overnight. They crept in slowly, like shadows lengthening across my living room floor as the afternoon sun shifted. At first, I told myself that Bob's increased attention was simply his way of processing his own grief over Harold's death. After all, losing a father is difficult at any age, and perhaps checking on me gave him comfort during his own period of mourning. I welcomed his visits, prepared for them, looked forward to them with the kind of eager anticipation I hadn't felt since Harold passed. But by the third month of these regular visits, I began to notice patterns that made me uncomfortable. Bob would arrive with a mental checklist that he seemed determined to complete before leaving. He'd inspect the locks on my doors, test my smoke detectors, check the expiration dates on items in my refrigerator, and examine my pill organizer to make sure I was taking my medications correctly. Jennifer would trail behind him with her own agenda, straightening picture frames that weren't crooked, reorganizing my kitchen drawers according to some system that made sense only to her, and collecting items she deemed unnecessary or potentially dangerous. The first thing to disappear was my stepladder. Harold had kept a small aluminum stepladder in the utility closet for reaching high shelves, changing light bulbs, and accessing storage areas in our basement. I'd used it countless times over the years without incident, always careful to ensure it was stable before climbing up. But during one of their visits, Jennifer noticed me retrieving a serving platter from the top shelf of my china cabinet. "Maggie, you shouldn't be climbing on ladders at your age," she said, rushing over to spot me as if I were about to tumble to my death. "What if you fell? What if you broke a hip? You could lie here for hours before anyone found you." I explained that I'd been using that stepladder safely for decades, that I was careful and deliberate in my movements, and that I needed access to my own belongings in my own home. But the following week, when I went to retrieve the stepladder for spring cleaning, it was gone. Bob had taken it without asking, leaving me unable to reach items that had been accessible to me just days before. When I called to ask about it, Bob's tone was patronizing in a way that made my stomach clench. "Mom, we moved it to our garage for safekeeping. If you need something from a high shelf, just call us and we'll come over to get it for you. It's much safer that way." Safer for whom, I wondered? Safer for Bob, who apparently couldn't bear the thought of me living independently. Safer for Jennifer, who seemed to view every aspect of my daily routine as a potential lawsuit waiting to happen. It certainly wasn't safer for me, since I now had to depend on their schedule and availability for tasks I'd been managing perfectly well on my own. The stepladder was just the beginning. Over the following weeks, other items began to vanish from my home. The small electric heater I kept in my bedroom for particularly cold nights disappeared after Jennifer declared it a fire hazard. My gardening tools were relocated to their shed after Bob decided they were too heavy for me to handle safely. Even my good kitchen knives were replaced with duller versions that Jennifer purchased at a discount store, claiming that sharp blades were dangerous for someone with arthritis. Each removal was presented as an act of love and concern. Each substitution was framed as an improvement to my safety and well-being. But the cumulative effect was that my home was slowly being stripped of the tools and implements that allowed me to live independently. I was being infantilized one household item at a time, and my protests were dismissed as stubbornness or confusion. The worst part was how they talked about me when they thought I couldn't hear. I'd be in the kitchen preparing tea while they sat in my living room, and their voices would carry down the hallway. Jennifer would express concern about my obvious decline and wonder aloud whether I should really be living alone. Bob would share observations about my forgetfulness or my slower movements, as if these normal signs of aging were evidence of incompetence. They discussed my driving with particular alarm. I'd been driving for over 50 years without a single accident, but suddenly my careful approach to parking and my preference for familiar routes were interpreted as signs of diminished capacity. Bob started offering to drive me to appointments and errands, which seemed helpful until I realized he was keeping track of where I went and questioning my judgment about whether certain trips were necessary. When I mentioned wanting to visit my longtime friend Eleanor, who lived 30 minutes away in Middleton, Bob frowned and shook his head. "Mom, that's a lot of highway driving. What if something happened? What if you got confused and took the wrong exit?" He offered to drive me himself, but only if I could wait until the following weekend, when his schedule was less busy. Eleanor and I had been trying to coordinate a visit for months, and his conditions made it impossible to maintain the spontaneous friendship we'd always enjoyed. I began to feel like a teenager asking permission from disapproving parents. Simple activities that had given my life structure and pleasure were suddenly subject to Bob and Jennifer's approval. They wanted to know where I was going, why I needed to go there, whether the trip was absolutely necessary, and whether someone could accomplish the same task on my behalf. My independence was being eroded through 1,000 small restrictions, each one presented as reasonable and caring. The grocery shopping became a particular source of friction. I'd always enjoyed my weekly trips to the supermarket, taking my time to compare prices, select fresh produce, and chat with familiar cashiers and other shoppers. It was one of my primary forms of social interaction, and the ritual of planning meals and choosing ingredients gave me a sense of purpose and autonomy. But Bob and Jennifer decided that grocery shopping was too strenuous for someone my age, especially during Wisconsin winters, when parking lots could be icy. They arranged for grocery delivery without consulting me about my preferences. The delivery service required orders to be placed online, which meant Bob or Jennifer controlled what food came into my house. They chose items based on what they thought was healthy for me, rather than what I actually wanted to eat. My refrigerator filled up with low-sodium soups, sugar-free desserts, and bland frozen meals designed for seniors. The fresh herbs I like to grow and use in my cooking were deemed unnecessary since the prepared foods came pre-seasoned. When I complained that the delivered groceries didn't match my tastes or my cooking style, Jennifer looked at me with exaggerated patience. "Maggie, we're trying to help you maintain a healthy diet. Too much sodium isn't good for your blood pressure, and you don't need all that sugar and fat. These meals are specifically designed for people your age with your health concerns." But I didn't have significant health concerns. My blood pressure was well controlled with medication, my cholesterol levels were normal, and my doctor had never suggested any dietary restrictions. The healthy diet they were imposing on me was based on assumptions about what elderly people should eat, rather than on my actual medical needs or personal preferences. More importantly, it removed another area of choice and control from my daily life. The social isolation was perhaps the most damaging aspect of their increasing control. My circle of friends had naturally diminished over the years as people moved away, became ill, or passed away. But I still maintained meaningful relationships with several women my age. We'd meet for coffee, attend church events together, and visit each other's homes for afternoon tea and conversation. These relationships were crucial to my emotional well-being and my sense of connection to the community I'd lived in for decades. But Bob and Jennifer began to view my social activities with suspicion. They worried about me driving to meet friends, especially in the evening or during bad weather. They questioned whether other women my age were really capable of looking out for each other, or whether we might be enabling each other's poor decisions. When I mentioned plans to attend a church potluck or a book club meeting, they'd pepper me with questions about who would be there, whether anyone would be available to help if I needed assistance, and whether I was sure I felt well enough to go out. Their concern felt suffocating rather than caring. Every social engagement became a negotiation, with me having to justify my desire to spend time with friends, and them expressing doubt about my ability to do so safely. Gradually, it became easier to decline invitations than to endure the interrogation and worry that preceded each outing. My world grew smaller and quieter, exactly the opposite of what I needed during this period of adjustment to widowhood. The most painful aspect of this growing disconnect was the way Bob and Jennifer talked to me. Their tone had shifted from the normal conversational style of adults speaking to each other to the careful, simplified way people speak to children or patients. They explained things I already understood, repeated information I'd already acknowledged, and spoke slowly as if I might have difficulty processing normal speech. Jennifer had developed a particularly grating habit of praising me for completing basic tasks. When I remembered to take my vitamins, she'd say, "Good job, Maggie," in the same tone she might use with her 8-year-old daughter. When I mentioned that I'd balanced my checkbook or paid my bills, she'd beam at me and say, "That's wonderful. You're so responsible." As if these were remarkable achievements, rather than routine activities I'd been handling competently for my entire adult life. Bob had started explaining my own household systems to me, as if I might have forgotten how my own home worked. He'd point out that I kept my car keys on a hook by the front door, as if this was a fascinating discovery rather than a system Harold and I had used for decades. He'd remind me that my thermostat had a timer function, apparently unaware that I'd been programming that same thermostat every winter for 15 years. They seemed to have forgotten that I'd managed a classroom of 33rd graders for most of my career, handling everything from academic instruction to playground disputes to parent conferences. They'd forgotten that I'd run a household, raised children, supported a husband through a long illness, and navigated widowhood with grace and resilience. In their minds, I'd somehow become a fragile, confused old woman who needed their guidance to function safely in the world. The breaking point came during a visit in late November. I'd been looking forward to hosting Thanksgiving dinner as I had for the past 30 years. Harold and I had always opened our home to family and friends who had nowhere else to go, and I saw no reason to abandon that tradition just because I was cooking for fewer people. I'd already planned the menu, ordered the turkey, and invited Ruth Ellen from next door and Martha from down the street. When Bob and Jennifer arrived for their weekly visit, I excitedly shared my Thanksgiving plans. Instead of the enthusiasm I expected, they exchanged one of their loaded glances, and Bob cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mom, we've actually been talking about Thanksgiving," Bob said carefully. "We think it would be better if you came to our house this year. Jennifer's already started planning the meal, and we have more space for everyone." I felt my stomach sink. "But I've already invited Ruth Ellen and Martha. They're counting on having somewhere to go." Jennifer waved her hand dismissively. "I'm sure they'll understand. We can include them in our dinner if you'd like, though honestly, our table is already pretty full with my family coming from Milwaukee." What they weren't saying was clear. They didn't trust me to safely prepare a holiday meal. They thought I might burn the turkey, forget to turn off the oven, or somehow poison my guests with improperly cooked food. They were taking away not just my Thanksgiving tradition, but my role as a hostess, and my ability to provide hospitality to friends who needed it. "I've been cooking Thanksgiving dinner for 30 years, I said quietly. "I think I can manage it one more time." Bob's expression grew stern. "Mom, cooking a big meal is a lot of work. What if you forgot something in the oven? What if you hurt yourself lifting a heavy roasting pan? We're just thinking about your safety." Safety? That word had become the justification for every restriction they imposed, every choice they took away from me. In the name of safety, I was supposed to give up cooking, driving, gardening, and socializing. I was supposed to accept their supervision and control with gratitude, because they loved me enough to worry about my well-being. But safety without dignity isn't really safety at all. It's imprisonment disguised as care. And I was beginning to understand that no amount of reasoning or protest would change their minds. They decided I was declining, and every independent action I took was interpreted as evidence of impaired judgment rather than proof of my continued competence. That night, after they left, I sat in Harold's chair and stared at the empty fireplace. I missed him so desperately in that moment that it felt like a physical pain in my chest. Harold would never have questioned my ability to cook a holiday meal. He would never have assumed that age automatically meant incompetence. He would have trusted my judgment and supported my decisions, even if he had concerns about my safety. I thought about the woman I'd been just a few years earlier. Confident, capable, respected by my students and colleagues, valued by my husband and friends. That woman was still inside me, but she was being slowly suffocated by other people's assumptions about what old age meant. I was being transformed from Margaret Thompson, retired teacher and loving wife, into a collection of potential problems that needed to be managed and controlled. The phone rang while I was lost in these thoughts. It was Martha calling to confirm our Thanksgiving plans and to ask if she could bring her famous cranberry sauce recipe. I found myself in the impossible position of having to tell her that the dinner was canceled, not because I didn't want to host it, but because my son had decided I wasn't capable of doing so. Martha was quiet for a long moment after I explained the situation. Then she said something that stayed with me for weeks afterward. "Maggie, you know there's a difference between people who love you and people who want to control you, right? Sometimes they can look like the same thing, but they're not." After we hung up, I went upstairs to my bedroom and opened the drawer where I kept Harold's letters from when he was stationed overseas during his army service years before we married. His handwriting was careful and neat, his words full of respect for my intelligence and my independence. He'd written about his plans for our future together, always phrasing things as partnerships and shared decisions, rather than as his choices that I would need to accept. In one letter, he'd written about the kind of marriage he hoped we'd have. "I want us to be two strong people who choose to build a life together, not one person taking care of the other like a child." I want to love you and support you without ever making you smaller than you are. Harold had kept that promise throughout our marriage. Even during his final illness, when he was physically dependent on my care, he never talked down to me or questioned my judgment. He trusted me to make medical decisions on his behalf, to manage our finances, and to plan for my future after he was gone. He saw his impending death as a transition I would navigate, with the same wisdom and strength I'd shown throughout our marriage. Bob and Jennifer saw only vulnerability where Harold had seen resilience. They saw confusion where he had seen thoughtfulness. They saw decline where he had seen adaptation. The contrast was stark and painful, and it made me realize that the problem wasn't my aging but their perception of what aging meant. I decided that night to start keeping a journal, not just of my thoughts and feelings but of my daily activities and accomplishments. I wanted a record of my actual capabilities, rather than their assumptions about my limitations. I wanted proof, for myself if no one else, that I was still the same competent person I'd always been. The journal became a refuge and a source of strength over the following weeks. Each evening, I'd write about what I'd accomplished that day, balanced my checkbook, prepared a nutritious meal, tended my plants, read a challenging book, solved a crossword puzzle, had a meaningful conversation with a friend. The accumulation of evidence was reassuring and empowering. I was not the failing, confused woman Bob and Jennifer seemed to see, but the gap between their perception and my reality continued to widen. The more they tried to help me, the more constrained and diminished I felt. The more they expressed concern about my safety, the more they actually endangered my well-being by isolating me from the activities and relationships that gave my life meaning. I began to understand that their behavior wasn't really about me at all. It was about their own fears of aging, their own anxiety about mortality, their own need to feel useful and important in my life. By treating me as helpless, they positioned themselves as necessary. By creating problems that didn't exist, they made themselves indispensable for solving those problems. But understanding their motivations didn't make their behavior any less harmful or any easier to tolerate. I was still the one losing my independence, my dignity, and my sense of self-worth. I was still the one being transformed from a person into a project, from an individual with agency into a problem requiring management. The winter months stretched ahead of me, dark and cold and increasingly confined by their well-meaning restrictions. I knew something had to change, but I wasn't yet sure what form that change would take. All I knew was that I couldn't continue living as a diminished version of myself, grateful for whatever scraps of autonomy they decided to allow me. The secret I was keeping about my new will felt like a small flame of power in an increasingly powerless situation. They could take away my stepladder and my sharp knives and my social activities, but they couldn't take away my right to determine my own legacy. They could treat me like a child who needed supervision, but they couldn't force me to reward that treatment with my gratitude or my inheritance. For now, that knowledge was enough to sustain me. But I knew the day would come when keeping my dignity would require more than just secret resistance. It would require action that they couldn't ignore or override, choices that would make my true feelings unmistakably clear. That day was coming sooner than any of us realized, and when it arrived, they would finally understand the cost of treating someone with disrespect for so long that you forget they have the power to respond. The morning started like any other Tuesday in February. Snow had fallen overnight, leaving a fresh white blanket across my front yard and coating the bare branches of Harold's oak trees. I stood at my kitchen window with my first cup of coffee, watching the neighbors' children build a snowman before school. The sight made me smile, remembering how Bob used to do the same thing in that exact spot 40 years ago, his mittened hands working earnestly to roll the perfect snowball while I watched from this same window. I'd dressed carefully that morning in my favorite burgundy sweater and gray wool slacks, clothes that made me feel put together and confident. I'd styled my hair with the same care I'd taken every morning for the past 60 years, applying a light coat of lipstick and the small gold earrings Harold had given me for our 10th anniversary. Looking in the mirror, I saw a woman who was aging gracefully but not surrendering to it, someone who still took pride in her appearance and her independence. The morning routine had become precious to me over the past few months, as Bob and Jennifer's interference had intensified. These quiet hours before they might arrive unannounced were mine alone, filled with simple pleasures like reading the newspaper cover to cover, tending to my houseplants, and enjoying my breakfast at the kitchen table while planning my day. I savored the freedom to move at my own pace, to choose what to wear without commentary, to eat what I wanted without judgment. Around 10:30, I heard car doors slamming in my driveway. Through the front window, I could see Bob's silver sedan and another car I didn't recognize, a white SUV with professional lettering on the side. My stomach clenched with apprehension. Bob and Jennifer rarely brought strangers to our family visits, and the official appearance of the second vehicle suggested this wasn't a casual check-in. Bob knocked on the front door but used his key before I could answer, a habit that had become increasingly irritating over recent months. He called out cheerfully as he entered, but his voice carried an undertone of nervous excitement that immediately put me on guard. Jennifer followed close behind, and with them was a woman I'd never seen before, someone in her 40s with a professional smile and a leather portfolio tucked under her arm. "Mom, I'd like you to meet Sandra Williams," Bob said, gesturing toward the stranger as if he were introducing me to an old friend. "She's from Caring Hearts Senior Services. I mentioned to you that we thought you might benefit from some additional support around the house." I hadn't agreed to any such thing. In fact, I'd specifically told Bob that I wasn't interested in hiring help and didn't need supervision in my own home. But here was this Sandra Williams person, standing in my living room with her clipboard and her assessment forms, ready to evaluate my need for services I'd never requested. Sandra stepped forward with the kind of practiced warmth that professional caregivers use with elderly clients. Her voice was deliberately gentle, slightly slower than normal speech, and infused with the artificial sweetness that made my skin crawl. "Mrs. Thompson, it's wonderful to meet you. Your son has told me so much about you. I understand you've been living independently since your husband passed, and that's really admirable. But we know how challenging that can be, especially during these winter months." I looked directly at Bob, ignoring Sandra's patronizing tone. "I didn't realize we had an appointment today. I would have appreciated being consulted before you brought someone into my home." Bob's cheeks flushed slightly, but his expression remained determinedly cheerful. "I wanted it to be a surprise, Mom. I know you've been resistant to the idea of getting some help, but I thought if you could just meet Sandra and hear about the services they offer, you might see how beneficial it could be." The word resistant stung. It implied that my preference for independence was unreasonable, something to be overcome rather than respected. It suggested that my clearly stated wishes were obstacles to be managed, rather than legitimate choices made by a competent adult. Sandra opened her portfolio and pulled out a glossy brochure. "Let me tell you about what we do, Mrs. Thompson. Caring Hearts specializes in helping seniors maintain their independence while ensuring they have the support they need for daily activities. We can assist with medication management, meal preparation, light housekeeping, transportation to appointments, and personal care needs." Personal care needs. The phrase hung in the air like an accusation. I thought about my morning routine, how I'd dressed myself with the same competence I'd demonstrated every day for 7 decades. I thought about the breakfast I'd prepared and eaten without assistance, the coffee I'd brewed to exactly the strength I preferred, the newspaper I'd read and understood completely. "I don't need assistance with personal care," I said firmly. "I'm perfectly capable of managing my own hygiene, my own meals, and my own medication." Jennifer spoke up from where she'd positioned herself near my bookshelf, apparently examining my collection of novels with exaggerated interest. "Maggie, we're not saying you can't do these things. We're just thinking about what happens if you have a bad day, or if your arthritis flares up, or if you just need someone to talk to." But that wasn't what this was about, and we all knew it. This was about Bob and Jennifer's discomfort with my independence, their need to feel like they were managing my life properly, their desire to transform me from an autonomous individual into a supervised dependent. Sandra pulled out a form and clicked her pen with practiced efficiency. "Why don't we start with a simple assessment? Just a few questions about your daily routine so we can better understand how we might be helpful." The questions started innocuously enough. What time did I typically wake up? How did I prefer to prepare my breakfast? Did I have any difficulty with stairs or mobility around the house? But gradually they became more invasive and more pointed. How often did I bathe? Did I ever forget to take my medications? Had I experienced any confusion about dates or times? Did I feel safe living alone? Each question felt like a trap designed to elicit evidence of incompetence or vulnerability. When I mentioned that I sometimes stayed in my pajamas until afternoon on days when I wasn't going out, Sandra made a note and exchanged a meaningful glance with Bob. When I admitted that I occasionally had to check my pill organizer twice to make sure I'd taken my morning vitamins, she wrote something down with particular emphasis. The most humiliating part was how Bob and Jennifer participated in this interrogation. They offered their own observations about my behavior, pointing out incidents and patterns that painted me as increasingly frail and forgetful. Bob mentioned that he'd found expired food in my refrigerator during his last visit, failing to note that the items in question were condiments that had been past their printed dates by only a few weeks. Jennifer shared her concern about my inappropriate clothing choices, describing how I'd worn the same dress to church 2 Sundays in a row as if this indicated serious cognitive decline. They talked about me as if I weren't sitting right there, as if I were a subject to be studied rather than a person with thoughts and feelings about my own life. Their words transformed perfectly normal behaviors into symptoms of decline, routine preferences into evidence of impairment. When Sandra asked about my social activities, Bob jumped in before I could respond. She's become much more isolated lately. She doesn't drive as much as she used to, and she's stopped going to a lot of the activities she used to enjoy. What he didn't mention was that they'd actively discouraged my participation in those activities. He didn't explain that I'd stopped driving to certain places because he'd made me feel unsafe and irresponsible for wanting to do so. He didn't acknowledge that my social isolation was largely the result of their interference rather than my own declining interest in maintaining relationships. Sandra nodded sympathetically and made more notes. Social isolation is a common concern for seniors living alone. Having a companion come in a few times a week can really help with that. Our caregivers are trained to provide not just practical assistance but emotional support and companionship. I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. This stranger was talking about providing me with purchased friendship, professional companionship that would be scheduled and supervised and documented in reports. The suggestion that I needed to pay someone to care about my well-being felt like the ultimate negation of my worth as a human being. I have friends, I said quietly. I have neighbors I've known for decades. I have a church community and volunteer commitments. I'm not isolated. Sandra's smile became even more patronizing. Oh, I'm sure you do, Mrs. Thompson. But sometimes as we age, it becomes harder to maintain those relationships. People move away, or they develop their own health concerns, or they just don't have the energy they used to have. Having professional support can fill in those gaps. She was describing a world in which elderly people were abandoned by everyone who had ever cared about them, left to depend on paid strangers for human connection. It was a bleak and depressing vision of aging, and it bore no resemblance to my actual experience of getting older in a community where I'd lived and worked for 50 years. The assessment continued for over an hour, covering everything from my sleeping patterns, to my financial management, to my ability to operate household appliances safely. Sandra asked to see my medication bottles, my emergency contact list, and my daily calendar. She wanted to know about my exercise routine, my dietary habits, and my plans for handling household maintenance as I continued to age. Through it all, Bob and Jennifer provided commentary that consistently undermined my competence and independence. They mentioned my occasional forgetfulness while ignoring my sharp memory for important details. They worried about my physical safety while overlooking my careful attention to household security and my sensible approach to activity modification. They expressed concern about my judgment while dismissing the wisdom I'd accumulated over 7 decades of successful, independent living. The breaking point came when Sandra asked to observe me completing a few simple tasks. She wanted to watch me prepare a cup of tea, organize my pill dispenser for the next week, and demonstrate my ability to safely navigate my own staircase. The request was presented as routine, just a standard part of their assessment process, but it felt like the ultimate humiliation. I was being asked to perform basic life skills for the entertainment and evaluation of strangers in my own home. I was being tested like a child learning to tie her shoes, or a patient recovering from a brain injury. My 74 years of competent adult living apparently counted for nothing against their need to document my current functional capacity. I don't think that's necessary, I said, standing up from my chair with what I hoped was dignity. I've been making tea and taking medication and using my stairs successfully for years. I don't need to prove my competence to anyone. Sandra's expression shifted slightly, losing some of its professional warmth. Mrs. Thompson, I understand this feels intrusive, but these assessments are really for your own protection. If something were to happen to you, having documentation of your current abilities helps us recommend the most appropriate level of care. Protection. There was that word again, the justification for every indignity they wanted to impose on me. I was supposed to submit to their evaluation and accept their supervision because it was for my own good, because I was too old and too foolish to recognize my own vulnerability. I looked at Bob, hoping to see some recognition of how inappropriate this situation had become. Instead, I saw impatience and frustration. He was annoyed with my resistance, irritated that I wasn't cooperating with his plan to have me professionally assessed and managed. "Mom, just let her do the evaluation," he said, with the tone of an adult reasoning with a stubborn child. "It's not a big deal. She just wants to make sure you're safe." But it was a big deal. It was the difference between being treated as a person with agency and being treated as a problem requiring solution. It was the difference between being respected for my experience and being judged by my limitations. It was the difference between being loved for who I was and being managed for who they thought I was becoming. I excused myself to use the bathroom, needing a moment away from their scrutiny and their assumptions. In the mirror above my sink, I saw the same woman who had woken up that morning feeling confident and capable. My reflection showed no signs of the confusion or incompetence they seemed so eager to document. I was alert, appropriately dressed, well-groomed, and completely aware of what was happening to me. When I returned to the living room, Sandra was discussing care packages and service options with Bob and Jennifer as if I'd already agreed to hire them. They were debating whether I needed daily check-ins or if 3 times a week would be sufficient. They were comparing the benefits of different levels of supervision and support. They were planning my future without my input, making decisions about my life based on their assessment of my needs. "I haven't agreed to any services," I interrupted. "I've listened to your presentation, and I'm not interested in hiring help at this time." Sandra turned to me with the patient expression healthcare professionals use when dealing with difficult patients. "Mrs. Thompson, I understand this is a big decision. Many seniors feel reluctant to accept help initially, but your family is clearly concerned about your well-being, and our services are designed to help you maintain your independence, not take it away." The irony was staggering. They were claiming that accepting supervision would help me maintain independence, that surrendering my autonomy would somehow preserve it. They were suggesting that the best way to continue living on my own terms was to allow strangers to monitor and manage my daily activities. Bob stepped forward with an expression I recognized from his childhood, the look he'd worn when he was determined to get his way despite parental objections. "Mom, we've already discussed this. You're not getting any younger, and winter weather makes everything more dangerous. Having someone check on you a few times a week isn't going to hurt anything." But we hadn't discussed it. He'd mentioned the possibility of hiring help. I'd declined, and he'd apparently decided to proceed anyway. He'd made an appointment, brought strangers into my home, and allowed them to interrogate me about my personal habits and private routines without my consent. Jennifer joined the conversation with her own brand of manipulative concern. "Maggie, we love you too much to just stand by and watch you struggle. We want you to be safe and happy, and if that means getting a little extra help around the house, what's wrong with that?" What was wrong with it was that I wasn't struggling. I was managing my life competently and independently, making my own decisions and solving my own problems. What was wrong with it was that their definition of safety required me to give up everything that made my life meaningful and dignified. Sandra opened her portfolio again and pulled out a contract. "I'll tell you what, Mrs. Thompson, why don't we start with a trial period? Just 2 visits a week for the first month, very light assistance with housekeeping and companionship. If you don't find it helpful, you can always discontinue the service." The contract was already partially filled out with my name and address. They'd come prepared to sign me up, regardless of my response to their assessment. The whole evaluation had been a performance designed to justify a decision they'd already made. I stared at the document in Sandra's hands, epic carefully printed terms that would transform me from an independent homeowner into a supervised client. I thought about the morning I'd had just hours earlier, peaceful and private, and entirely my own. I thought about the future they were planning for me, filled with scheduled visits and documented observations and professional interventions. "No," I said quietly. "I won't be signing anything today." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Bob's jaw tightened, and Jennifer's expression shifted from fake concern to genuine irritation. Sandra maintained her professional composure, but I could see the calculation in her eyes as she reassessed the situation. "Mrs. Thompson," Sandra said carefully, "I want to make sure you understand what we're offering. Our caregivers are thoroughly trained and background checked. They're not there to take over your life, just to provide support when you need it." "I understand perfectly," I replied. "I'm 74 years old, not stupid. I know exactly what you're offering, and I'm declining your services." Bob's control finally snapped. His voice rose as he said, "Mom, you're being unreasonable. We're trying to help you, and you're acting like we're the enemy. Do you want to fall down those stairs and lie there for days before someone finds you? Do you want to forget to take your medication and end up in the hospital?" His words hit me like physical blows. He was describing scenarios designed to frighten me into compliance, painting pictures of disaster and abandonment that bore no relationship to my actual circumstances. He was using fear as a weapon to force me into accepting supervision I didn't want or need. "What I want," I said, standing up and moving toward the front door, "is for all of you to leave my house. Right now." Sandra began packing her materials with practiced efficiency, clearly familiar with situations where family members disagreed about care decisions. She handed Bob her business card and suggested that they might want to give Mrs. Thompson some time to think about it before moving forward. Jennifer made one last attempt at emotional manipulation. "Maggie, we're doing this because we love you. Someday you'll understand that we were just trying to take care of you. But love doesn't require the beloved to surrender their dignity. Care doesn't demand the elimination of choice. Taking care of someone shouldn't feel like taking over their life." After they left, I sat in my living room surrounded by the silence they'd shattered with their intervention. The house felt different somehow, as if their presence had contaminated the peace I'd worked so hard to maintain. I looked around at my belongings, my furniture, my carefully tended space, and wondered how much longer it would truly be mine. That evening, I called David Patterson's office and left a message asking him to schedule another appointment as soon as possible. The new will I'd drafted was suddenly more urgent than I'd realized. If Bob and Jennifer were willing to ambush me with care assessments and override my clearly stated wishes, what other decisions might they try to make on my behalf? I spent the rest of the evening reviewing the legal documents Harold and I had prepared years earlier. My healthcare directive clearly stated my preferences for medical treatment and end-of-life care, but it also designated Bob as my healthcare proxy. My financial power of attorney documents gave him authority to manage my affairs if I became incapacitated. All of these arrangements had been made with love and trust, based on the assumption that Bob would respect my wishes and act in my best interests. But trust, once broken, changes everything. The son who would bring strangers into my home to evaluate my competence against my will might also be willing to invoke those legal authorities prematurely or inappropriately. The family members who talked about me as if I were already incapacitated might be eager to make that assessment official. I realized that protecting my autonomy would require more than just changing my will. I needed to review and possibly revise all of my legal arrangements to ensure that my rights and preferences would be respected, even if Bob and Jennifer continued to believe they knew better than I did about my own needs. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in months. The previous day's humiliation had been painful but illuminating. I finally understood the extent of Bob and Jennifer's disrespect for my independence, and their willingness to override my wishes in pursuit of their own peace of mind. More importantly, I understood that this was only the beginning if I allowed them to continue treating me as incompetent and unreasonable. The interventions would only escalate. Today it was care assessments and service contracts. Tomorrow it might be guardianship proceedings and nursing home placements. But I wasn't powerless, despite their efforts to make me feel that way. I had legal rights, financial resources, and cognitive abilities that no amount of condescension could eliminate. I had choices they couldn't take away, and decisions they couldn't override. The battle for my dignity was far from over, but the previous day had taught me exactly what I was fighting against and why victory was so essential. They wanted to save me from imaginary dangers by destroying the very things that made my life worth living. I couldn't let that happen, not to myself, and not to the memory of the strong, independent woman Harold had loved and respected for 50 years. The war for my autonomy had begun in earnest, and I intended to win it on my own terms. The days following Sandra Williams's unwelcome visit felt different in ways I couldn't immediately articulate. Something fundamental had shifted inside me, like a lock clicking into place or a puzzle piece finally finding its proper position. I moved through my daily routines with heightened awareness, paying attention to every task I completed successfully, every decision I made independently, every moment when my mind worked exactly as it always had. I began documenting these moments not just in my journal but in my memory, creating a mental catalog of competence that I could refer to whenever doubt crept in. When I balanced my checkbook to the penny on Wednesday morning, I noted it. When I successfully programmed my DVD player to record a documentary I wanted to watch, I acknowledged my technical skill. When I prepared a complex casserole from memory, adjusting the seasonings by taste and timing the components perfectly, I recognized my culinary expertise. The woman who needed help getting dressed, according to Bob and Jennifer, had somehow managed to coordinate a burgundy silk blouse with charcoal slacks and a pearl necklace that complemented both pieces beautifully. The woman who supposedly required supervision to take her medications correctly had organized her weekly pill dispenser with the precision of a pharmacist, cross-referencing prescription bottles with her doctor's written instructions. The woman who allegedly couldn't be trusted to make sound decisions had just successfully negotiated a better rate on her homeowner's insurance after researching multiple companies and comparing coverage options. The disconnect between their perception and my reality became so stark that I wondered if we were living in parallel universes. In their version of events, I was a declining elderly woman whose judgment couldn't be trusted and whose safety required constant vigilance. In my version, I was the same intelligent, capable person I'd always been, adapting to the normal changes of aging while maintaining my essential competence and independence. I decided to conduct my own assessment, one that would provide objective evidence of my abilities rather than subjective interpretations of my limitations. Over the course of 2 weeks, I kept detailed records of everything I accomplished each day. I timed myself completing various tasks to establish baseline measures of my efficiency. I photographed the meals I prepared, the household projects I completed, and the correspondence I managed to create a visual record of my capabilities. The results were both reassuring and infuriating. I was functioning at a level that any reasonable person would consider normal for someone my age. My cooking remained creative and nutritious. My housekeeping maintained the standards Harold and I had established over 5 decades of marriage. My financial management showed the same attention to detail that had allowed us to build substantial savings and investments throughout our working years. Yet Bob and Jennifer seemed determined to focus exclusively on minor inconveniences they interpreted as major deficits. Yes, I sometimes had to search for my reading glasses, but I always found them, and they were usually exactly where I'd left them. Yes, I occasionally needed a moment to remember someone's name, but the information invariably came to me, and my conversations remained coherent and engaging. Yes, I moved more slowly than I had at 40, but I moved with purpose and arrived at my destination safely. Their selective attention to these completely normal aspects of aging, while ignoring my continued competence in areas that actually mattered, revealed the fundamental dishonesty of their concern. They weren't worried about my well-being. They were worried about their own comfort level with my aging process. They wanted me to need them in ways that would justify their interference and validate their sense of importance in my life. The phone calls became more frequent and more intrusive during this period. Bob would call at random times throughout the day, ostensibly to check on me, but actually to monitor my activities and assess my mental state. He'd ask what I was doing, what I'd had for breakfast, whether I'd remembered to take my morning medications. If I didn't answer immediately because I was in the garden or the basement, or simply chose not to rush to the phone, He'd call back multiple times and then arrive at my house within the hour to make sure I was all right. Jennifer began stopping by unannounced with increasing frequency, always with some excuse about being in the neighborhood or needing to drop something off. But her real purpose was surveillance. She'd walk through my house with the keen eye of a building inspector, looking for evidence of neglect or confusion. She'd check my refrigerator for expired items, examine my housekeeping for signs of declining standards, and assess my appearance for anything that might suggest I was struggling with personal care. These surprise visits felt like pop quizzes designed to catch me failing, rather than genuine expressions of care and affection. I began to dread the sound of cars in my driveway, never knowing whether I was about to be subjected to another evaluation of my worthiness to live independently. The stress of constant monitoring was exhausting and demoralizing, far more harmful to my well-being than any of the theoretical risks they claimed to be protecting me from. The breaking point in this escalating campaign of supervision came on a Thursday afternoon in early March. I'd spent the morning at the library volunteering in the children's section as I'd done every Thursday for the past 3 years. Reading stories to preschoolers and helping them select books was one of my greatest joys, a way of staying connected to the teaching profession I'd loved and contributing something meaningful to my community. When I returned home around 1 o'clock, I found Bob's car in my driveway and Bob himself pacing anxiously on my front porch. He rushed toward me as I got out of my car, his face flushed with what looked like genuine panic. "Mom, where have you been?" he demanded before I'd even closed my car door. "I've been calling you for 2 hours. I was about to call the police." I stared at him in bewilderment. "I've been at the library, just like I am every Thursday. I've been volunteering there for 3 years, Bob. You know that." His relief quickly transformed into irritation. "You should have told me you were going out. What if something had happened to you? What if you'd fallen or gotten confused and couldn't find your way home?" The accusations stung because it was so fundamentally unreasonable. I was a grown woman who had every right to leave my own house without reporting my whereabouts to anyone. I'd been driving the same route to the same library for decades. I'd never gotten lost or confused or failed to return home safely. His demand that I account for my movements like a teenager asking permission to use the family car was both insulting and infuriating. "I don't need to clear my schedule with you, Bob," I said as calmly as I could manage. "I'm perfectly capable of going where I want to go, when I want to go there." But my assertion of independence only seemed to fuel his frustration. "Mom, you're not thinking clearly about this. You live alone. You don't have neighbors who check on you regularly. If something happened to you while you were out, we might not know about it for days." This was factually incorrect on multiple levels. Ruth Ellen next door kept an informal eye on my comings and goings, as neighbors in our community had always done for each other. Martha called me most evenings just to chat, and would certainly notice if I failed to answer for several days in a row. The librarians at my volunteer position would contact someone if I failed to show up without explanation. I wasn't living in the kind of isolation Bob described, but his portrayal of my circumstances served his narrative about my vulnerability and need for supervision. More troubling was his assumption that I couldn't be trusted to navigate familiar places or handle minor emergencies. He seemed to genuinely believe that a woman who had successfully managed a classroom, raised 3 children, and cared for a dying husband might suddenly become incapable of driving to the library and back without getting hopelessly lost or injured. I invited him inside and made tea, hoping that normal conversation in familiar surroundings might restore some perspective to our interaction. But Bob remained agitated and focused on what he perceived as the crisis of my unsupervised activities. "This is exactly what I'm talking about, Mom," he said, stirring his tea with more force than necessary. "You're not considering the risks of living alone and going out by yourself. You need to start thinking more carefully about your safety." Safety. Again. The word had become a bludgeon he used to beat down any assertion of my independence or any resistance to his increasing control. In the name of safety, I was supposed to surrender my privacy, my autonomy, and my right to make my own decisions about how to spend my time. "Bob," I said, setting down my cup and looking directly at him, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. I am not an invalid. I am not confused. I am not incompetent. I am a 74-year-old woman who is aging normally and managing her life successfully. Your constant monitoring and criticism are not helping me, they're hurting me. His response revealed the depth of his inability to see me as I actually was. Mom, I know you think you're managing fine, but you're not seeing the whole picture. You're not objective about your own limitations. The irony was breathtaking. He was accusing me of lacking objectivity, while demonstrating his own complete inability to assess my actual capabilities versus his assumptions about what women my age should or shouldn't be able to do. He was telling me I couldn't see the truth about my own life while refusing to acknowledge evidence that contradicted his predetermined conclusions about my decline. That evening, after Bob left with renewed warnings about the importance of staying in touch and being more careful about my activities, I sat in my living room and made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable just months earlier. I was going to have to actively resist my own son's efforts to control my life. I was going to have to fight for my right to remain independent and autonomous. Not just passively, but aggressively. The first step was securing my legal and financial independence in ways that Bob couldn't override or undermine. I called David Patterson's office first thing Friday morning and scheduled an emergency appointment for that afternoon. When I explained the urgency of my situation, Carol moved other appointments around to accommodate me, recognizing something in my voice that suggested this wasn't a routine legal matter. David's office felt like a sanctuary when I arrived that afternoon, a place where my competence was assumed rather than questioned, and my wishes were respected rather than dismissed. I explained the escalating pattern of Bob and Jennifer's interference, their attempts to impose supervision I didn't want, and my growing concern that they might try to use legal means to override my preferences if I didn't take protective action immediately. David listened with the serious attention I'd been craving for months. He didn't interrupt to suggest that Bob and Jennifer might be right about my need for help. He didn't question my assessment of my own capabilities, or imply that my resistance to their interference was evidence of impaired judgment. He treated me like the competent adult I was, and took my concerns at face value. "Mrs. Thompson," he said when I finished explaining the situation, "what you're describing sounds like the early stages of what we sometimes see in guardianship cases. Adult children who become convinced that their elderly parents can't make sound decisions often start with informal interventions like the ones you've described. If those don't work, they sometimes pursue legal guardianship to gain official authority over their parents' affairs. The possibility hadn't occurred to me, but it made perfect sense given Bob and Jennifer's escalating pattern of treating me as incompetent. If they genuinely believed I couldn't be trusted to make decisions about my own care and safety, they might conclude that legal intervention was necessary to protect me from myself. "What can I do to prevent that?" I asked. David opened a file and began making notes. "Several things. First, we can revise your advance directives to include very specific language about your preferences for care and your right to make your own decisions, as long as you remain competent. Second, we can establish a competency evaluation protocol that would require multiple independent assessments before anyone could challenge your decision-making capacity. Third, we can set up your financial accounts in ways that would make it very difficult for anyone to claim you're being financially exploited or making poor money management decisions." We spent 2 hours that afternoon constructing legal barriers around my autonomy. The new advance directive included explicit language stating that I considered myself competent to make my own medical, financial, and personal care decisions, and that any attempt to override those decisions would require clear and convincing evidence of incapacity as determined by multiple qualified professionals. The financial arrangements included safeguards that would protect my assets while documenting my continued competent management of my affairs. Most importantly, David helped me revise my healthcare proxy and financial power of attorney documents to remove Bob as my designated agent and replace him with Ruth Ellen, my neighbor, who had agreed to serve in this capacity if needed. Ruth Ellen was only 2 years younger than I was, but she was someone who respected my judgment and would be more likely to honor my actual wishes rather than substituting her own preferences. Walking out of David's office that afternoon, I felt like I was carrying a shield against the forces that had been trying to diminish me. The legal documents in my purse represented more than just paperwork. They were proof that the law recognized my right to remain autonomous and that there were systems in place to protect that right even when family members disagreed with my choices. But the most important change wasn't legal. It was psychological. For the first time since Harold's death, I felt like I was actively shaping my own future, rather than simply responding to other people's plans for me. I was no longer the passive recipient of Bob and Jennifer's increasingly intrusive care. I was a woman taking charge of her own destiny with the wisdom and determination that come from 7 decades of successful independent living. The transformation wasn't complete, but it had begun. The woman who supposedly needed help getting dressed had just spent an afternoon making sophisticated legal arrangements to protect her own interests. The woman who allegedly couldn't be trusted to make sound decisions had just demonstrated exactly the kind of foresight and strategic thinking that competent adults use to safeguard their future well-being. Bob and Jennifer would eventually discover that their assumptions about my decline had been not just wrong but costly. They would learn that underestimating someone's strength and intelligence carries consequences that extend far beyond hurt feelings. They would understand, perhaps too late, that respect isn't just a nicety in family relationships but a prerequisite for maintaining them. For now, though, I was content to keep my own counsel and protect my secrets. The balance of power in our relationship had shifted in ways they couldn't yet perceive, and I intended to use that advantage wisely. The battle for my dignity was far from over, but I was finally fighting it on my own terms with weapons they didn't know I possessed. The phone call came on a crisp October morning exactly 8 months after Sandra Williams had invaded my living room with her clipboard and condescending smile. I was in my kitchen making Harold's favorite apple cinnamon muffins, the house filled with the warm scents of autumn baking, when David Patterson's voice cut through my peaceful morning routine. "Mrs. Thompson, I have some news I think you'll want to hear in person. Could you come in this afternoon?" His tone carried a gravity that made my stomach flutter, but there was something else underneath it, something that might have been satisfaction. I agreed to meet him at 2 o'clock and spent the intervening hours trying not to speculate about what could be so urgent and yet somehow pleasing. David's office felt familiar now after our months of legal maneuvering. The afternoon sunlight streamed through his tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny celebrations in the golden air. He gestured for me to sit in my usual chair and opened a thick folder that hadn't been there during my previous visits. "Margaret, I've received some interesting correspondence regarding your estate planning," he began, his professional composure barely containing what looked like amusement. "It seems that Bob has been making inquiries about challenging your recent will changes." My heart skipped, but David raised his hand before I could speak. The interesting part is what happened when he tried to pursue those inquiries. He pulled out a letter on official letterhead and slid it across his desk. "This is from the firm Bob consulted about contesting your will. They've declined to take his case." I read the letter carefully, savoring each word. The attorney had conducted a preliminary assessment of Bob's claims and found them without merit. They noted that I had demonstrated clear mental competence during our meetings, that my decisions appeared rational and well considered, and that I had good cause for my estate planning choices based on documented patterns of family behavior. "But that's not the best part," David continued, pulling out another document. "This is a copy of a psychiatric evaluation Bob apparently obtained, hoping to use it as evidence of your incompetence. The evaluation, conducted by Dr. Patricia Morrison, was devastating in its thoroughness and completely contrary to Bob's expectations. Dr. Morrison had concluded that I showed no signs of cognitive impairment, demonstrated excellent judgment and reasoning abilities, and appeared to be managing my life with remarkable competence for someone of any age. She specifically noted that my concerns about family interference appeared well-founded, and that my legal preparations showed sophisticated planning and foresight." "How did you get copies of these documents?" I asked. David's smile widened. Bob's attorney felt obligated to share them with me as part of their due diligence investigation. They wanted to make sure there weren't competing claims or conflicting evidence before they declined the case. Dr. Morrison was particularly helpful. She actually called me directly to express her concern about what she termed, quote, "adult children attempting to gaslight a competent elderly parent." The vindication felt sweeter than I had imagined it would. Every assessment Bob had sought to prove my incompetence had instead documented my continued sharpness and independence. Every professional he'd consulted had sided with my right to make my own decisions and manage my own affairs. "There's more," David said, producing a final document. "The Wisconsin Department of Health Services received an anonymous complaint alleging that you were being financially exploited by family members. They investigated and found the complaint to be without merit, but their report is quite interesting. The state investigation had uncovered Bob and Jennifer's pattern of attempting to control my finances and living situation. Social workers had interviewed my neighbors, my doctor, and the staff at the library where I volunteered. Every single person had described me as alert, competent, and appropriately independent. Several had expressed concern about Bob's increasingly intrusive behavior and Jennifer's attempts to isolate me from my normal activities. The investigator's conclusion," David read from the report, "is that Mrs. Thompson is a victim of family members who appear to be positioning themselves for financial gain by undermining her confidence and independence." I sat back in my chair, overwhelmed by the scope of professional validation I'd received. Every expert who had actually evaluated my situation had reached the same conclusion. I was competent, my concerns were legitimate, and Bob and Jennifer's behavior was inappropriate and potentially harmful. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now you live your life exactly as you choose to," David replied. "Your legal protections are ironclad, your competence is professionally documented, and any future attempts at interference will be much more difficult to pursue." That evening, I called Ruth Ellen and invited her over for tea and celebration. As we sat in my living room with the muffins I'd baked that morning, I told her about the day's revelations. Ruth Ellen had watched the entire drama unfold from her front window, had seen Bob's increasingly frantic visits, and Jennifer's surveillance missions. "I always wondered what they thought they were accomplishing," Ruth Ellen said, shaking her head. "Anyone with eyes could see you were managing just fine on your own." The next morning brought the final piece of my vindication. Bob called, his voice subdued and careful in a way I hadn't heard since he was a child who'd been caught misbehaving. "Mom, I think we need to talk," he said. "Could I come over this afternoon?" When he arrived, Bob looked older somehow, diminished by the failure of his campaign to prove me incompetent. He sat on my sofa with his hands folded in his lap, avoiding eye contact like a guilty schoolboy. "I owe you an apology," he began quietly. "I thought I was helping you, but I see now that I was wrong." I let the silence stretch between us, waiting to see how deep his understanding actually went. "The lawyers and doctors all said the same thing," he continued. "You're fine, you've been fine all along. I guess I was seeing problems that weren't really there." "Why do you think that happened, Bob?" I asked. He was quiet for a long moment. "I think I was scared," he admitted. "Scared of losing you like we lost Dad. Scared of you getting hurt. Scared of not being a good enough son." For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of the love I'd always had for this man who was still, despite everything, my child. But love doesn't erase consequences, and understanding doesn't automatically restore trust. "I've made some changes to my estate planning," I told him gently. "Changes that reflect how I've been treated and what I've learned about respect and dignity." His face went pale, but he nodded. "I understand," he said. "I probably deserve whatever you've decided." The conversation that followed was honest in a way we hadn't managed in years. I explained how his behavior had made me feel diminished and disrespected. He acknowledged the damage he'd done to our relationship and accepted responsibility for his choices. We didn't solve everything that afternoon, but we began the long process of rebuilding on a foundation of honesty rather than assumption. 6 months later, Bob and Jennifer attended the dedication ceremony for the Margaret Thompson Reading Garden at Jefferson Elementary School. The scholarship fund I'd established had provided its first grants to children who needed books and school supplies. The memorial garden featured benches where students could read outdoors and a small plaque that read, "In honor of those who nurture independence and dignity in all seasons of life." Bob approached me after the ceremony with tears in his eyes. "Mom, I'm proud of what you've done here, and I'm sorry it took me so long to see who you really are." I took his arm and smiled. "The woman who supposedly needed help getting dressed just helped herself to a much better legacy," I said. "And you know what? I think your father would be proud of both of us for figuring it out. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.